gold trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Well, welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee with you for the next half hour. And I'm a fiend for boats, Bill. I mean, I just don't think enough has been said about boats. So you're going to help me out today.
No, it's one of the subjects you never go tired of, really, Mike. When I think of boats, I think of the Fraser River. I think of the great rivers of British Columbia. And of course, the Fraser is probably the unfettered river of the province. There's not much doubt about it. And it comes into its own in 1858 when there's gold discovered on the Fraser itself. And then, of course, the Sternwheelers start running on the Fraser. And then in 1861, gold is discovered in massive quantities in the Caribou district, and it really leaps to the fore. And with that, of course, here's an example. Here's a photograph of the Caribou district in about 1860s. And then we have a very, very nice print. A very nice print, Hole for the Fraser.
Now, this was taken from a publication in San Francisco.
San Francisco, yeah.
Now, obviously, the guy who did the cartooning or the etching knew how to spell Fraser, but the guy who put in the subtitle did not.
Yeah, the first maps indicate Fraser with a Z or with an S.
Look at the throngs of people that he's making an editorial statement there, but that's what happened. Hundreds of boats left San Francisco and poured into not the Fraser River, first of all, but other spots.
They poured into 3 different areas in British Columbia, and certainly they poured into Yale, which is really quite spectacular. And here's an old shot of Front Street in Yale. The Branch Saloon is there. This is an 1860 shot, and it shows the definition of Yale and how it looked when the first guy walked up off the Sternwheelers at Sternwheeler Landing and walked right up onto Front Street in Yale, and it's really quite magnificent.
It is, and it's so electrically clear. I mean, the detail is wonderful.
Yeah.
And there is the country. He's about to embark on the greatest adventure of his life.
Sure, and here's another shot of Yale, just and indicates Front Street with a longer view of Yale itself.
Look at, there's freight wagons there. There's these clapboard buildings have just been put up, and all of that building material, where did it come from? Did they saw it on site, or did it come up in these Sternwheelers?
Actually, they saw it on site. They had several sawmills very close to Yale, so that was the end of navigation, really. It was the head of the canyon, or the bottom of the canyon.
Things got kind of sticky at that point. I mean, the Fraser Canyon and navigating it was a bit ahead.
Sure.
But Victoria was also, and New Westminster were also figured highly in this.
Yeah, well, New Westminster, you can see several shots here, and
the Steamboat Exchange.
Steamboat Exchange, that's probably 1870s, Mike, and that gives an indication of, and probably a sternwheeler captain there. Some of them wore uniforms, some did not.
What did a Steamboat Exchange do? What was that
building? Well, that'd be a saloon.
It was a saloon.
Oh, for sure.
I'm see. Okay, it takes me a little while to catch on. And here's a dock, tides out. Looks like a dugout canoe, sort of lying in there. But that's a dock in New Westminster.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's an early shot of New Westminster. Probably 1870s again, Mike.
And look at all that wood stacked there. That's cordwood for the Sternwheelers.
For the Sternwheelers
to use.
They had to feed the. And that's Columbia Street. It considerably changed from today, and probably about 1870s again. Very remarkable photograph, because there's no distortion of the photographs when they use a glass plate.
That is Columbia Street. It's right down. Look at, you can picture that, and there's looking across the Fraser.
Yeah, very early shot. Probably 1864. I think that came out of a shot that was put in one of the American magazines, probably Harper's. And that's an early shot, very early of New Westminster. As it looked, when you were on a Sternwheeler, that's what you saw in New Westminster.
And that's why, I mean, the size of that community is why New Westminster wanted to be the capital of British Columbia.
And was for a brief period of time.
And was for a brief
period of time.
And we mentioned Victoria, too. Sure. Victoria, although it was on the island, was it the first place people stopped?
Oh, yeah, sure it was. I mean, Victoria became a fort.
Was that a government regulation that they stopped there before they go to New Westminster?
No, but it was a logical place to stop, because most of those Sternwheelers came up from San Francisco and Sacramento and all down the coast and Portland and so on. So they stopped at Victoria. There was a fort there. The Hudson's Bay Company was in charge. There's the original bastion. That's probably, again, in the 1860s, 1870s, and gives you an idea of the crudeness of that first fort that was built by Douglas in Victoria.
Yeah, it's just something. And it looks like a snow fence more than a palisade across the front. And there's downtown. What street do you figure that is?
I think that's Johnson Street. It could be Douglas Street, too, and I'm having a tough time tracking that in my mind, Mike, but it's either Johnson or Douglas. Not much doubt that it's one of the two.
So if a viewer happens to know whether the Birmingham House and Murray's or the Scotch House, what street they were on.
Well, we know that Daly took that photograph because Daly photographers, you can see it right in the photograph. So these are your three major, now there are a lot of other stopping points in between, but it was certainly Yale, certainly New Westminster, and then Victoria.
All right.
And the Sternwheeler era begins then.
All right. Sternwheelers are what we're talking about on the Fraser. We'll come back to that right after this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee talking about the Sternwheelers of the Fraser River. And any tabulation on how many Sternwheelers
well,
were
Mike,
on the
I'm guessing a little bit. I would think there would be somewhere around 50, but that is a guess. I know that the Sternwheelers lasted, some of them blew up, some of them were lost, some of them were transferred to the Skeena and other areas in British Columbia. The captains tended to go back and forth between the Skeena and the Fraser and some of the other rivers, the Stakeen and so on. Some of the captains, of course, the most famous family, I guess, were the Irvings, William Irving and John Irving, and they're kind of an interesting family. And here's a photograph of William Irving, and he founded the Irving line, and he died very suddenly in New Westminster at a rather young age, actually, for those days, late 50s, I believe. And his son took over. His son was 18 years old. He was a Sternwheeler captain by 19.
And I mean, did that carry with it? I mean, obviously you're only as good as your survival rate. Did he turn out to be good?
Was perhaps the most interesting of the captains outside of Billy Moore, which we'll discuss very briefly, and have discussed before. He was a two-fisted fighter, a two-handed drinker, and an open-handed benefactor. Now that's kind of unusual. And he spent his last days actually traveling the CPR ships because that was the only way he could survive. And died actually penniless with 1,000 friends and no money at all. So he lost the fortune, lost the family fortune, and didn't last. But was one of those typical Sternwheeler captains who stayed in people's memory for a long, long time.
So he got to be a captain at 19, and he stayed
19,
at it?
Oh, for years, until the CPR bought him out many years later.
Amazing.
Yeah, and Billy Moore, of course, we've discussed in another program. He was famous. And the Sternwheeler captains, of course, they all wanted the business. And what they did, of course, which was kind of unusual, they tended to cut rates. They sometimes got together, but when they got in a real brawl, they would cut rates right down to the bottom. In fact, it was so cheap, Mike, coming from Yale right to New Westminster, that they charged 25 cents, 1/4 a passenger, all the way downriver, and 50 cents a ton. And this is a war between the Irvings and Billy Moore, and of course Billy Moore lost out because his pockets weren't as deep.
But so they were willing to lose money hand over fist to get rid of him.
Sure, sure.
Now, I could see coasting downriver could be cheaper, but was it 25 cents going back upriver the same?
Sure.
Good heavens. So how long did it take them to finally...
usually a few months, and they were broke. I mean, Billy Moore spent $50,000 on a Sternwheeler, and they had to sell it at auction for $8,000. So there was, and that was when money was really worth a lot in those days. And $1,000 was a lot of money. You were a very wealthy man with $1,000. That is not the case today. And of course, there were accidents. I mean, there were a number of ships that went up on the Fraser River. Yeah.
And usually you think of ships going down, but these went up.
Yeah, they did actually, and the Enterprise. And here's a shot of the Enterprise, and that's kind of an interesting. And it had problems. It collided.
It collided with something.
Yeah. And the Fort Yale, it went up in Union Bar, and it was followed by the Henrietta. And interesting, I believe, if I remember correctly, the Henrietta, when it blew up, there were two people in the pilot house. One was the Captain Jameson, and another was a man he knew very, very well. And when it blew up, Captain Jameson went right up to the top of the cabin house, or the pilot house. They never did find him. And the other guy next 2 feet away wasn't even scratched.
Good heavens. Yeah, so that's the will of the wisp of explosions aboard. Now, what were these explosions all about? What was the...
Well, steam pressure was too high. And some of the captains, Moore was an example, and most of the other captains would jam the pressure gauge so they could go way beyond what the law allowed. Well, sometimes that allowed a horrific explosion. I mean, the Yosemite, which you can see here.
This is an elegant-looking boat, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, beautiful boat, yeah. And the Yosemite was a side wheeler, came out of San Francisco, but before it was refitted for a Victoria on that run up the Fraser River, it had killed 55 people in an explosion. Virtually half the people on board were killed by a terrific explosion caused by too much pressure.
And they recommissioned it after they repaired it? And
of course, recommissioned it, sent it up to Canada.
No one will know.
Yeah.
It'll be fine. William, what's this, Wilson G. Hunt?
Well, the Wilson G. Hunt was also one of the Sternwheelers. That's a side wheeler that came onto the Fraser. And there were a number of these boats that came onto the Fraser that had accidents, sometimes within a week of each other. I think the Royal City went up one week and killed 4 people. The next week, the Ramona blew up and killed 2 more people. So it was not unusual. You took your chances when you walked onto a sternwheeler and you examined the captain very, very closely. In fact, it became so dangerous some of the times, one of the engineers jumped right overboard into the Fraser River because he felt the steam pressure was too high and it was going to blow up, and he'd rather jump in the river than get blown up with a boat. As it happened, they had to turn around and pick him up, and they lowered the pressure, and he was all right.
Now, I mean, why did they hammer the steam? Was there that much pressure to, I mean, was there that much urgency to get from A to B with the most passengers?
Well, quite
often.
Was it
just pride?
Yeah, of course it was pride. They were racing each other quite often. They didn't do it on the inland lakes as much, but on the rivers, there was a real rivalry between the captains. I don't care whether it was the Skeena or the Stickeen or the Fraser. They had a real thing about it. They wanted to beat the other captain, and virtually no holds barred at all, Mike.
So the second guy into port was plain ugly loser.
That's right, he
and
was.
There was everything to be gained by being the first.
And the other captain didn't let him forget it.
Now, you've got a kind of a superstitious story of a man who's master of his ship.
Yeah, well, all the captains were superstitious, but certainly I think William Irving was one of the most superstitious of all. He's pulling his sternwheeler into Yale one time at Steamboat Landing, and down the bank comes a parson. He's all ready to get on board. And Irving looks around, and he sees there's a gray horse on board, and he says to the parson, "You can't get on board." The parson says, "Why?" He says, "I got a gray horse on board." He says, "Well, so what?" He said, 3 times I've had a parson and a gray horse on board this ship, and 3 times we've had an accident. You're not getting on board.
You would never think to test the gods one more time or kick the horse off.
Of course not. I wasn't going to move the horse. The parson stayed behind.
They carried everything aboard these.
They did.
You know, I mean, passengers primarily, or what other? What
carried gold? I mean, all the way down from the Caribou Gold Rush. I mean, they carried in one of these boats. They carried half a ton of placer gold, Mike. Half a ton of placer gold was worth about $200,000 at the time. Worth a heck of a lot now, but millions really. Yeah. But that was typical, and of course that the word got out that they were carrying all sorts of gold. Didn't have to worry about robbers because the robbers couldn't catch the sternwheelers, any highwaymen. Right. But typical of the times.
He keeps pointing to this because I mean every time you show something like this, what have I got here? About a half a pound.
About half a pound.
A half a pound of gold nuggets, and contemplate a half a ton.
Yeah, half a ton.
Gold.
Multiply that by 2,000 times.
Now, a half a ton might surprise people about how big that would be in, say, cubic inches, cubic feet.
Only about that big.
Like maybe a foot by a foot, 18 inches by?
Yeah, max, absolute maximum.
And that would be a half a ton of gold worth $200,000.
But it'd be packed in different leather gold pokes and different containers and so on. Jars and bottles and all the rest of it, yeah.
You're not sort of sitting on a story about a sternwheeler that went down on the Fraser anywhere and the gold with it. I mean, that never happened?
Well, yeah, there were. The Henrietta, I mean, certainly I had a part of the Henrietta, but we don't know what was lost there. I can't find the records of the Henrietta when it went down.
Was it going upstream or down when it went up?
It was coming down through Seven Sisters Rapids, Mike.
So coming down would indicate that it could have had, because you wouldn't go in with gold, you'd come out with gold.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Seven Sisters Rapids, eh? Where would that be on the Fraser?
It's between Yale and Hope.
All right, that's not a story that you were contemplating telling, I know. The first sternwheeler to make it through the Fraser Canyon was the Scuzzy.
Yeah, the Scuzzy.
Now, tell me about the first trip it made.
Well, the CPR felt they could save some money if they sent a sternwheeler up the Fraser Canyon, so they started at actually Spuzzum and tried to get up to Boston Bar. And it was a real battle. They had the line all the way, ring bolts anchored right into the rocks to pull the sternwheeler up. It made 16 miles in 16 days.
This was not an economical trip, but
no.
Did they figure out a cheaper way to do it?
Actually, they got it down to a fairly fine art by the end of it, and actually the Scuzzy continued to make that trip, and the CPR did, as they usually do, save money.
Do you know how it happened? I mean, what magical technique violating the properties of physics did they manage to
Well,
occur?
they managed to line it up, and they managed to get a better route, and they read the river well, and the Fraser is one of the great rivers of the province, so they figured it out pretty quickly. Yeah. But it was a tough slug.
All right. What's the name of those rapids again, where the Henrietta might have just gone down?
Seven Sisters.
Seven Sisters. All right. Take a break here. We've got other stories to tell, and we'll do that right after these words. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley, and we're talking about the Sternwheelers of the Fraser River and all of the things that go along with that. When we've done shows about trains, there were excursion trains. Sure. People went out on them just to be aboard a train.
Of course.
Excursions aboard Sternwheelers seem to me, telling me what you have about their exploding capabilities, sort of a dangerous adventure.
Well, but they didn't really press their luck when they had a lot of people on board. Yeah. When there was an excursion, usually they weren't racing. People were out to enjoy the river, listen to the paddle wheels hit the water, and kind of a nice way to spend a Sunday afternoon.
And look at them out, they're all on board there, all in their finery.
Yeah, just off New Westminster for sure.
Yeah. Now, what is the connection? Because you've got a bunch of fire photographs here. What is the connection between fires and Sternwheelers, say in Yale?
Well, in Yale, it may have been started by a Sternwheeler. In New Westminster, it certainly was, almost definitely. And in Yale, in 1881, all of Front Street burned. And here's an example of the devastation caused by a fire in Yale. May or may not have been a spark from a Sternwheeler, but certainly it was in some of the other fires. And this shows what happened. Yale never did recover from that, Mike. They were building the CPR down through the canyon. This is 1881. And of course, the CPR was essentially to spell, it was the death knell of the Sternwheelers on the Fraser. Not immediately. There was a slow decline in the number of Sternwheelers on the river. But this is what happened in Yale, but it was a pale comparison to what happened in New Westminster.
Oh, yeah, there's the before shot in New Westminster. That is Columbia Street in all its glory.
Yeah, that's before 1898, prior to the fire.
Yeah, and a burgeoning community. Look at those stores, substantial four-story stores in some cases.
Yeah, a very, very, very wealthy city in 1898. And what happened, of course, one of the Sternwheelers pulled into the Sternwheeler landing down in New Westminster, and it started a spark that they couldn't put out, and before long, that's what you had after the fire stopped in New Westminster.
Now that was a conflagration of immense proportions.
Yeah, it was the biggest fire in British Columbia by far, Mike. It cost about $2.5 million in 1898. That would be over 200, well, about 100 to 150 million today. It wiped out 100 acres of New Westminster. And these next four photographs show you an example of what it did to New Westminster. It was just it was complete fire. It just leveled everything in its path.
Did this help in Victoria's cause of being, did this fire come at a pivotal moment? Did they have to sort of get away from their plea to become the capital and start rebuilding or something?
Well, not really. I mean, they weren't the capital by that time, and Vancouver had really outstripped New Westminster. But these photographs give you an example of what happened. Picture after picture after picture of the devastation of New Westminster in 1898. And sometimes you get the odd memento that's left here and there. You can...
Well, these are a couple of coins that were picked out of Yale, as a matter of fact. And this one is that's a Canadian $50, fire blackened.
Yep.
Who did the picking out? That's the kind of story you like to have associated with a coin.
One of those I purchased from August Sinclair Milliken, who was an old-timer in Yale, and he got that on Front Street in Yale. That was the American one, 1858 at the height of the gold rush on the Fraser.
Yeah.
And the other one's 1881 when the fire occurred. So that was a new coin then, and that was picked up by a guy who was doing the roads in Yale and sold it to me for, I don't know, $8 or $10 some 20 years ago, probably 20 years ago. Well, that was quite a bit then.
I mean, that's when you have, what do you call that, when you have the story behind the artifact?
That's the provenance of the artifact. Documentation is what it really is, but it's called provenance in archaeological circles.
A lot of guys have coin blackening equipment at home just so they can say, "Now that one was hauled out of the Great Fire of '42."
Yeah, it's done. You got to watch your coin buyers and your coin sellers.
And you figure this is the legitimate story because you knew the guy?
Yeah, I knew the guy, and the scratches are still on it from where the grader hit the road and turfed over the coin and so on.
Gee, you know, I found a loonie the other day, but I spent it. You know, history isn't what it used to be.
Yeah, it's true.
Now, so when your Sternwheelers start burning down your major centers, this has got to irritate major city owners.
Yeah.
Did this signify the end of the Sternwheeler
No, the
thing?
fire insurance companies essentially paid up, and the Sternwheelers were declining by 1898. Not much doubt about it, Mike. There were some that still ran the river. And the last Sternwheeler on the river was a Sternwheeler brought down by a Captain Seymour, who had been on the Skeena. So he brought his boat all the way down through the Inside Passage and going through that marvelous country, and thought he would spend his retiring years on the Fraser. He didn't make any money, and here's a photograph of the Skeena, and I think in all its glory.
Very pretty boat.
Yeah, probably the 1920s, and the captain's either in the pilot house, may not be, or just below the pilot house, and I think he's just below the pilot house.
You would think so? He wouldn't be in the pilot house for the shot?
Usually, but for this photo, he might not. He might be outside the pilot house, knowing he wouldn't be identified in the pilot house. And he operated this right till 1925. And when Seymour passed away, essentially it was the last Sternwheeler on the Fraser River. It was docked and torn apart, and it's simply disappeared.
Gee, 1925.
Yeah.
You know, when we see the opening of this program, we see a film of a Sternwheeler on the Yukon River, and they operated for quite considerably longer.
Did, yeah.
And we have a video of the Minto on the Arrow Lakes.
Yeah.
But 1925, you'd think there'd be film of that. You'd think there'd be film of, say, the Sycamoose on the Okanagan, because it operated till the 30s.
Yeah, I thought there was a film out in the Sycamoose, but I haven't found it, and I don't think you have either, Mike. Yeah. And I don't know whether there is any on the Fraser or not, because the 1920s is not that late, really. I mean, you know, it's and it's late enough that they had movie projectors in 1915 and earlier.
Sure, and it would be exciting. It would be historic. It would be the kind of thing. I mean, cameramen love to have action taking place in the viewfinder.
Sure.
So that would be a treasure. And I always, I mean, one treasure and another. We always talk about how valuable photos are, how valuable artifacts are, but film of something like that would be...
Yeah, very, very impressive, and you have to be very careful of it, how you store it. You should store it in cold storage, certainly, usually in a refrigerator, which is surprising.
Yeah. Well, the one story, now there's no particular treasure story that we want to allude to here, except for the Henrietta. Now, I just keep thinking about this. I mean, there it was. Why didn't it... I mean, have you given it a thought about why it might be not a treasure boat?
Yeah, I have, Mike, but I have no documentation to prove that the Henrietta was a treasure boat. Obviously, people were carrying money, probably carrying gold. It was in the early years, and they were coming down through a very dangerous stretch of river. But whether or not there's anything on the bottom of the Fraser there, I don't know.
There you go. I've got a couple of things to talk about here. Look at this beautiful little piece of work, and of course, archivists will go crazy because I'm handling it with my fingers. But this is a first-day cover from the Wells Fargo Company. Yeah. Now, what impressed you about this, first of all, that you would want to buy?
Well, a couple of things there. It's sent to the Hudson's Bay Company, so obviously it went to Victoria, and it's early. It has a double imprint from the Wells Fargo Company, and on the bottom it has NWA, Northwest America. Doesn't have Canada at all. So that pretty well dates it. It's probably 1860s. British Columbia was not part of Canada till 1871. So this is very rare, very tough to get, and people should be very, very careful if they have one of these. Some of them are worth, that's probably only worth a few $100s. Some of them are worth several $1,000s, Mike.
Sounds interesting, but we'll have to tell that another time. Gold Trails and Ghost Towns back next week. We'll see you then.